Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Shadow Storyteller. Before we begin tonight's tale, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and leave your thoughts in the comment section below. Your support helps me bring more bedtime stories for you, filled with mystery, warmth, and unforgettable moments. Now, settle in, perhaps with a cup of tea or while lying under your blanket, and let me take you to the quiet, snow-covered woods of California, where an English traveler found himself snowed in. It was late December 2019, just a few days before New Year's Eve, when Thomas Whitfield, a 34-year-old teacher from Manchester, arrived at Lake Tahoe for the very first time. He had taken a winter break to the United States, eager to escape the bustle of London and spend some time surrounded by mountains and fresh alpine air. The drive from Reno Airport had been uneventful at first. The roads were clear, and Thomas rented a modest Subaru Outback, recommended by the clerk who assured him it was the safest option for the snowy terrain. By the time he reached the small wooden cabin he had booked through an online listing, tucked away on the western side of Lake Tahoe near Emerald Bay, it was already past 5 in the evening. The sun had dipped low, painting the sky in shades of lavender and gold, while the lake itself shimmered faintly under the fading light. The cabin looked exactly as the photograph had promised, rustic yet charming, with smoke already rising from a stone chimney. Inside, it smelled faintly of pine wood and old books. A stack of firewood was neatly arranged by the hearth, and there was a large window that offered a sweeping view of the lake and the forested hills beyond. For Thomas, who had grown up with rainy Christmases in England, the snow that blanketed the ground felt almost unreal, like stepping into a postcard scene. He unpacked lightly, just a suitcase, a journal, and a few novels he had been meaning to finish. The silence outside was deep, interrupted only by the distant call of a raven and the occasional cracking of ice as the temperature dropped further. He made himself a cup of tea, sat by the fire, and wrote a few lines in his journal. Lake Tahoe feels endless. The snow seems to swallow every sound. Tonight, I feel like the last person left in the world. But as evening turned into night, the weather shifted dramatically. Clouds thickened, winds began to howl, and by midnight, a heavy snowstorm had descended over the lake. The power flickered once, then twice, before going out entirely. Thomas, sitting by the window, watched as the snow piled higher and higher against the porch steps. The car he had parked just outside was quickly disappearing under a mound of white. At first, he wasn't worried. He had food supplies, canned soup bread, and some tea bags. The cabin's fireplace gave steady warmth, and he reassured himself that the storm would pass by morning. Still, he couldn't shake the unease that came with the silence between gusts of wind. It was too quiet, almost pressing, and the shadows that danced across the cabin walls seemed longer, stranger, as though the storm itself was trying to creep inside. The following morning, December 30th, Thomas stepped outside. The world was buried under nearly 2 feet of snow. The path back to the main road was gone, and his phone displayed no signal. He was truly cut off. The air was so cold that his breath lingered in the air, and the trees stood frozen, their branches weighed down like heavy arms. Somewhere far in the forest, a branch cracked and fell with a sound that made Thomas flinch. Back inside, he tried to busy himself, reading, making notes, even sketching the view from the window. But as the hours passed, a new feeling settled in: isolation. It was both beautiful and unsettling. On one hand, he was in the heart of nature, surrounded by peace. On the other, the storm had made him a prisoner in this wooden cabin on the edge of a vast, frozen lake. And then, just after dusk, as he sat by the fire listening to the storm rage on, Thomas heard something unexpected. A knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks at the door. Thomas froze when the sound came again. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate, almost too measured for someone simply seeking shelter. For a moment he told himself it was just the wind, perhaps a loose branch scraping against the wooden frame of the cabin. Yet the rhythm had been unmistakable, too human to be dismissed as coincidence. He stood from his chair, his knees stiff from sitting too long by the fire. The warmth of the room clung to him, but as soon as he reached for the door, a draft of cold air seemed to creep in through the edges. His heart beat faster. He hesitated with his hand on the iron latch. "Hello." His voice was cautious, muffled by the thickness of the wood. There was no immediate reply, just the relentless sound of the storm outside. Snow hissed against the window. Wind howled through the forest. And for a few seconds he began to wonder if he had truly imagined it. Then, faint but clear, came a voice. "Please, is anyone inside?" The accent was American, male, a little strained as though speaking through clenched teeth. Thomas opened the door a fraction, the icy air rushing in instantly, biting at his face. Standing there was a man bundled in a thick parka, snow caked onto his shoulders and hood. His beard was frosted white, and his eyes, blue and sharp, looked both desperate and wary. "My car is stuck, just down the road," the stranger said, breathing heavily. "I can't stay out here." Instinct battled with caution in Thomas's mind. He had read enough travel advisories to know that not everyone stranded on snowy roads was harmless. But at the same time, this was a storm, and leaving anyone outside could mean death. He pulled the door wider. "Come in, quickly." The man stepped inside, stamping the snow off his boots. He smelled faintly of gasoline and wet wool. Thomas closed the door firmly behind him, and the cabin was once again wrapped in dim firelight and the soft crackle of logs. "Thank you," the man muttered, pulling off his gloves and rubbing his hands together. "Name's Daniel. Daniel Hayes. Was driving from Truckee to South Lake when the storm hit. Took a wrong turn, I guess." Thomas nodded, still studying him. "Thomas Whitfield. I'm renting this place for the week. You're lucky you found it. It's not exactly on the main road." Daniel let out a shaky laugh. "Lucky's one way to put it. I thought I was finished out there." They sat by the fire for a while, letting the silence return, broken only by the occasional pop from the burning wood. Daniel's presence filled the cabin differently than the emptiness Thomas had felt before. It wasn't exactly comforting. There was an edge of tension in the air, as though neither of them quite trusted the other yet. As night deepened, the storm grew fiercer. Snow pressed against the windows, and the roof groaned under the weight. Thomas poured tea into 2 chipped mugs he found in the cupboard, while Daniel recounted fragments of his story. He worked in Sacramento, he said, and had been driving up to see a friend before New Year's Eve. His car had slid off the road when visibility dropped, and he had tried to walk for help before stumbling across the cabin. Thomas listened, though part of him wondered about the gaps in the tale. There had been no mention of the friend's name, nor why Daniel had chosen such a remote route. Still, the warmth of the tea and the fire dulled his suspicion, at least for the moment. By midnight, both men agreed it was too dangerous to attempt any rescue or contact with the outside world. With the power still out, they relied on firelight and a couple of candles Thomas had found in a drawer. Daniel stretched out on the sofa, while Thomas returned to the armchair by the window. The storm howled like a living thing, and the cabin shuddered with each gust. Sleep came only in fragments. Every so often, Thomas would stir and glance at Daniel, who seemed restless even in slumber, shifting and muttering under his breath. Once, Thomas thought he heard him whisper a name, but he couldn't catch it. The morning of December 31st dawned gray and still. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. The forest looked like a cathedral of glass and frost, the lake beyond silent under a thin veil of mist. The snow outside reached nearly to the windowsill, making it impossible to open the door without shoveling. Daniel was already awake, pacing slowly near the hearth. "No signal still," he said, holding up his phone. "We might be stuck here for a while." Thomas nodded. "I've enough food for two, but not for long. We'll have to ration it." The next 2 days blurred together in a rhythm of survival. They melted snow for water, shared the dwindling cans of soup, and kept the fire burning around the clock. Conversation came in uneven bursts. Sometimes Daniel spoke about his childhood in Nevada, about hunting trips with his father. Sometimes he fell silent for hours, staring into the flames with a look that unsettled Thomas. On the night of New Year's Eve, they made a small toast with tea. The world outside was utterly still, as if holding its breath. Thomas found himself reflecting on how strange it was to be here in America, thousands of miles from home, ringing in the new year with a stranger whose presence was both a comfort and a mystery. But just after midnight, when Thomas returned from fetching another log for the fire, he noticed something that made his heart race. Daniel's parka, hung over the back of the chair, had slipped slightly from its inner pocket. The corner of a folded photograph peeked out. It was old, slightly torn at the edges, but unmistakably deliberate in its hiding place. Thomas had only glimpsed it for a second before Daniel stepped back into the room. Their eyes met, and Daniel's expression shifted, tightening into something unreadable. "You're a curious one, aren't you, Thomas?" he said softly, almost too softly. The fire crackled. The cabin walls seemed to press closer. Outside, the snow gleamed in the faint light of a half-hidden moon. The fire popped again, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney. Thomas felt his throat dry, though the room itself was warm. He forced a smile, pretending he hadn't seen the photograph. "I was just looking for more wood," he said, gesturing toward the small pile by the hearth. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He simply reached for his parka, folded it neatly, and placed it on the sofa beside him, covering the pocket completely. His eyes, sharp and piercing, lingered on Thomas for a moment longer before he finally spoke. "You know," he said, his voice low and steady, "people don't usually make it through storms like this alone. Guess we were both lucky." Thomas nodded quickly. "Yes, lucky." But as he turned back to the fire, a quiet unease had already rooted itself in his chest. There was something about Daniel's presence, something about the way he guarded that small photograph, that unsettled him. He told himself it was just paranoia, born of isolation and the strangeness of their situation. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel's arrival had brought more than just company into the cabin. The 1st of January came with a brittle silence outside. The snow was deeper than before, reflecting a blinding brightness that poured through the window whenever the clouds parted. Thomas tried the radio again, but only static hissed from its speaker. His phone remained dead, as if the world beyond the forest had simply ceased to exist. Breakfast was thin, half a slice of bread each, and weak tea. Daniel chewed slowly, staring at the window. "If this doesn't melt soon," he muttered, "we'll be in trouble." Thomas tried to sound optimistic. Maybe someone will come by, a ranger or snowplow. But in truth, he wasn't certain. The cabin felt forgotten, buried under the weight of winter. By afternoon, Daniel decided to shovel a path to the car. Thomas watched from the doorway as he hacked at the thick snow with a small spade found in the shed. His movements were forceful, almost angry, as though fighting something more than the snow itself. After an hour, he gave up, shoulders heaving. "Useless," he said, throwing the spade down. "The engine's frozen, battery's dead. That car won't take us anywhere." That night, the cabin was even quieter than before. Thomas tried to read one of his novels by candlelight, but the words blurred and slipped away. His thoughts returned again and again to the photograph. Who was in it? Why hide it? Why guard it so fiercely? He considered asking directly, but something in Daniel's demeanor warned him not to. Later, just as Thomas was drifting into uneasy sleep, he was stirred by the sound of movement. Daniel was awake, pacing near the door. He seemed restless, muttering again under his breath. Thomas closed his eyes quickly, feigning sleep, but kept his breathing shallow so he could listen. A few words floated through the silence. Should have never, it wasn't supposed to. His voice was ragged, filled with a weight Thomas couldn't place. The next morning, Thomas resolved to keep his distance. He spent most of the day outside, trudging carefully through the snow to gather fallen branches. The cold gnawed at his fingers, but the work gave him purpose. He thought of home, his small flat in Manchester, the sound of buses rolling past, the ordinary comfort of neighbors and familiar streets. How far away all that felt now, as though it belonged to another life entirely. When he returned to the cabin, Daniel was sitting by the fire with a photograph in his hands. He didn't hide it this time. Instead, he stared at it with an expression that blended grief and anger. Thomas hesitated, then finally spoke. "Someone close to you?" Daniel looked up sharply, as if caught. For a moment, Thomas thought he wouldn't answer. But then, slowly, Daniel turned the photograph around. It showed a woman and a young girl, standing by the shore of a lake. Both were smiling, their arms wrapped around each other. The photo was weathered, edges creased as if carried for a long time in a pocket. "My wife, my daughter," Daniel said quietly. "This was a long time ago." Thomas nodded. "They look happy." "They were," Daniel said. His jaw tightened. "Until I ruined it." Silence fell between them. Thomas didn't ask for details, sensing the weight of pain behind Daniel's words. Instead, he returned to his chair, the fire casting long shadows on the walls. The days slipped by, each one heavy with routine and unspoken tension. They rationed food, gathered wood, checked the snow for any sign of movement. The storm had passed, but the world remained frozen. Occasionally, the distant crack of shifting ice or the echo of falling branches broke the silence, reminding them how small they were in this wilderness. On the 3rd of January, Thomas woke to find Daniel gone. Panic struck him as he searched the cabin, only to spot tracks in the snow leading toward the forest. Heart pounding, he followed them, calling Daniel's name. He found him near the frozen edge of the lake, kneeling in the snow, the photograph clutched in his hands. His breath came in clouds, his shoulders shaking. "I shouldn't be here," Daniel said, voice trembling. "I was supposed to be with them that night, but I wasn't. And now—" His voice broke. Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder, unsure what to say. He didn't know Daniel's full story, but the grief was real, raw, like an open wound. They returned to the cabin together, silent. That evening, Daniel finally spoke of the accident. A winter drive years ago, a patch of ice, a crash that took both his wife and daughter. He had survived, barely. Ever since, he had been drifting, searching, running from ghosts. Thomas listened, the firelight flickering between them. For the first time, the unease lifted. He understood now. The guarded eyes, the restless pacing, the whispers in the night. Daniel wasn't dangerous. He was broken. Yet, even as sympathy replaced suspicion, Thomas knew they were still trapped. The snow showed no sign of melting, and their supplies dwindled further each day. Survival was becoming more urgent. On the 5th of January, a faint rumble reached their ears. At first, Thomas thought it was just the shifting of ice. But then it grew louder, steadier, the unmistakable sound of an engine. They rushed outside, waving frantically. A snowplough appeared in the distance, orange lights flashing against the endless white. Relief surged through Thomas, so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. Rescue had come at last. But as he glanced at Daniel, he saw a different expression, hesitation, almost fear. "You'll be able to go home now," Daniel said softly. "Back to England, back to your life." "And you?" Thomas asked, Daniel looked out at the lake, his eyes clouded. I don't know if I want to go back to. The snow pluff drew closer, carving a path through the frozen wilderness. The cabin, which had been their prison and their refuge, now stood as a reminder of everything they'd endured in those long, silent days. But the story wasn't finished. For even as the engine roared nearer, Thomas couldn't shake the sense that something more was about to unfold. Something that would tie his fate to Daniel's in ways he had not yet begun to understand. The snowplough slowed as it approached the cabin, its headlights cutting two sharp beams through the pale winter light. The engine's growl was almost deafening after days of silence. Thomas felt his chest rise with relief. The world outside had not forgotten him after all. The driver leaned out of the cab, a man with a thick brown beard and a heavy jacket, lined with fur. He shouted over the noise, "Roads, opening up, gentlemen. You two been stuck out here long." Thomas stepped forward, his boots sinking deep into the snow. Since before New Year's Eve, he called back. The driver whistled softly. "You're lucky. Another storm was predicted to roll in by the weekend. Best if you pack up soon. Follow me back toward the main road once I finish this stretch." Thomas nodded eagerly, but when he turned, he saw Daniel standing still, his expression unreadable. Snowflakes drifted gently from the gray sky, landing on his shoulders as he stared at the plow, almost as though he feared it. "Come on," Thomas urged, his voice carrying a nervous edge. "This is our chance." Daniel's eyes flickered toward him, but he didn't move. "You should go, Thomas. Take the way out while you can." The word stung with finality, as though Daniel had already decided his own path. Thomas frowned, stepping closer. "You can't stay here. The food's gone. The firewood won't last. You'll freeze." Daniel gave a thin smile. "I've lived in worse places. Survived worse winters." Thomas shook his head. "That's madness. You'll die here." For a moment, Daniel didn't answer. He just stared across the lake, where the mist clung stubbornly to the ice, blurring the line between water and sky. Sometimes dying in the snow feels easier than living with ghosts. The driver waved him on, clearly impatient. The engine's hum vibrated through the still air. Thomas placed a firm hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You told me about them. About your wife, your daughter. Do you think they want you to stay here, waiting for another storm to bury you? Or would they want you to keep living, no matter how heavy it feels?" Daniel's jaw tightened, his breath visible in the cold. For a long while, he said nothing. Then, almost reluctantly, he bent down, picked up his parka, and pulled it on. "Fine," he muttered, "but I don't know what I'm walking toward." Together, they returned inside, quickly gathering what little they had. 2 half-burnt candles, Thomas's journal, Daniel's photograph, a few cans and crumbs that would never last another day. The cabin, which had been both prison and shelter, felt strangely smaller as they prepared to leave. The fire hissed low in the grate, and for a moment Thomas glanced around, trying to fix the memory of its walls in his mind. When they stepped outside again, the snowplough was already clearing the last stretch of road. The driver waved once more, signaling for them to follow. The walk was exhausting. The snow was thick despite the machine's path, and every step seemed to drag. Thomas felt sweat form under his layers, even as his face burned with cold wind. Daniel moved slower, shoulders heavy, his boots crunching rhythmically in the half-frozen slush. By the time they reached the main road, the light was fading into an early winter dusk. The driver parked his plow near a small maintenance hut and gestured toward a waiting snowmobile with a trailer attached. "Got room for you both," he said. "Town's about 10 miles south. You'll find food, warmth, and a working phone." Thomas exhaled, the relief nearly overwhelming. He climbed onto the trailer, settling against the side. Daniel followed, sitting stiffly, his photograph clutched tightly in one hand, as though it might vanish if he let go. The snowmobile roared to life, jolting forward. Trees blurred past, their branches heavy with frost. The wind whipped against Thomas's cheeks, but he welcomed it. It meant movement, escape, survival. Yet as the ride stretched on, he noticed Daniel's gaze fixed steadily backward, toward the direction of the cabin, toward the endless white wilderness they had left behind. His lips moved slightly, though no words carried over the noise of the engine. They arrived in a small town called Myers just after nightfall. It was little more than a cluster of wooden houses, a petrol station, and a diner that glowed warmly against the dark. Thomas felt his stomach growl at the sight of it. The driver dropped him at the edge of the diner and gave a gruff nod. Good luck to you both. Inside, the smell of fried food and coffee wrapped around Thomas like a blanket. A jukebox hummed faintly in the corner, and a waitress in her 50s with tired eyes handed the menus. For the first time in days, Thomas felt something close to normal, but Daniel seemed restless, barely touching his food. He sat hunched, shoulders tense, the photograph on the table beside his plate. When the waitress asked if everything was all right, he gave only a curt nod. After the meal, Thomas finally borrowed the payphone by the entrance, the receiver cool against his ear. He dialed the international code, then his sister's number in Manchester. When she answered, her voice trembled with disbelief and relief. "Thomas, where on earth have you been? We saw the news about the storm. I thought—" "I'm safe," Thomas cut in gently. "I'll explain everything when I'm back. Just know that I'm all right." The line crackled. He promised he would call again once his travel was arranged. Then he replaced the receiver, his hand lingering on the cold metal a moment longer. When he turned back, Daniel was gone. The photograph still lay on the table. Thomas's stomach tightened. He hurried outside, scanning the street. The snow still fell lightly, the lamps casting pale circles of light on the ground. There was no sign of Daniel. He picked up the photograph, studying it under the dim glow. The woman and child smiled back at him, their frozen expressions full of life. On the back, faint handwriting in ink had nearly smudged away. He squinted, making out the words, Emerald Bay, December 2012. The same lake, the same shore, the same winter that had nearly claimed them both. Thomas felt the weight of it settle in his chest. Where had Daniel gone, and why leave behind the one thing he had carried so closely? The waitress approached, frowning slightly. "Your friend left in a hurry. Said he needed air." Thomas nodded, pocketing the photograph. He stepped back out into the night, the cold biting once more at his skin. The town was quiet, the streets nearly empty. Somewhere beyond the lights, the dark forest waited, silent and endless. He stood there for a long while, snow settling gently on his coat, wondering if he would ever see Daniel Hayes again, or the storm had carried more secrets than either of them had been ready to face. The snow fell in a soft hush over Myers, muting every sound until the world seemed wrapped in cotton. The diner's light spilled onto the street, leaving the edges of the town swallowed by darkness. Thomas tightened his coat around his chest and walked slowly along the road, his boots crunching against a thin layer of fresh snow. Daniel. His voice carried no further than a few yards before the night consumed it. He turned the photograph over in his hand, the inked words still faint beneath the lamplight. Emerald Bay, December 2012. The date gnawed at him. Why here? Why now? It was no coincidence that Daniel had ended up in Tahoe during another December storm. A gust of wind swept through the street, rattling the sign of the small petrol station across from the diner. Beyond it, the road sloped downward into shadow, leading toward the forested hills that bordered the lake. Thomas hesitated. The thought of stepping into that darkness chilled him more than the cold itself, but something in his chest urged him on. He couldn't just let Daniel vanish. He followed the road for several minutes, the town lights fading behind him until only the moon guided his way. The silence was immense, broken only by the occasional groan of trees straining under the weight of snow. His breath clouded before him, and each exhale sounded too loud in the stillness. Then faintly he heard a crunch of footsteps not his own. He stopped, heart thudding. The sound came from the tree line, off to his right. "Daniel?" He called again, louder this time. No reply. He stepped carefully toward the trees, the branches above heavy with ice. The snow beneath his boots sank deep, and cold seeped quickly through his socks. Just when he thought he had imagined the noise, he saw it. A figure, half hidden in shadow, standing still among the pines. "Daniel," Thomas said softly, as if speaking to a startled animal. The figure turned. It was him, his face pale under the moonlight, his breath ragged. "You shouldn't have followed," Daniel muttered. Thomas stepped closer. "You left without a word. You left the photograph." "Why?" Daniel's hand twitched at his side. Then he pulled the hood of his parka lower. "Because I don't need it anymore." "That picture, it's all you had," Thomas pressed. "You carried it through the storm. You guarded it like your life depended on it." Daniel looked past him, toward the road that wound back into town. "And yet, it only kept me prisoner. Every year I come here, every December, as if somehow I can change what happened." Thomas's chest tightened. "Emerald Bay. That's where—" "Yes," Daniel cut in, his voice rough. "The crash, the ice, their last winter." His eyes glistened, though he quickly looked away. "I thought the snow could bury it all, but it doesn't. It just buries me." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The forest creaked under the weight of frost, the air so cold that it burned Thomas's lungs. "You don't have to stay here," Thomas said finally. "Come back to town. Come back to life. Don't let the past be the only thing you have left." Daniel gave a hollow laugh. "Easy for you to say. You have somewhere to return to, people waiting for you. I've got nothing but that lake and the ghosts in it." Thomas wanted to argue, but the look in Daniel's eyes silenced him. It was not defiance he saw there, but a deep exhaustion, like a man who had walked too far and could not turn back. The sound of an engine drifted faintly from the distance, a truck passing through the main road. The world seemed to move on, indifferent to their small confrontation. "At last," Daniel spoke again. "Go, Thomas. You survived your storm. Don't stay caught in mine." He stepped back into the shadows, the trees swallowing him. "Wait." Thomas's voice cracked against the silence, but Daniel did not turn. Within moments, he was gone, his footsteps muffled by snow until there was nothing left but the whisper of wind. Thomas stood frozen for several minutes, the photograph burning like a weight in his pocket. His hand shook, not only from cold, but from the strange emptiness left behind. When he finally returned to the diner, the warmth felt distant, unreal. The waitress glanced up from behind the counter, her face lined with quiet concern. "Find your friend." Thomas shook his head slowly. "Not really." She didn't press further. Instead, she refilled his coffee and left him alone at the booth by the window. That night, in a small rented room above the diner, Thomas lay awake listening to the faint hum of a heater. He pulled the photograph from his pocket and set it on the bedside table, staring at the frozen smiles of the woman and girl. He tried to imagine the sound of their laughter, the warmth of the family Daniel had lost. But he also imagined Daniel still out there, wandering the snowy woods, chasing ghosts he could never catch. The thought made it impossible to sleep. The next morning, Thomas inquired at the local sheriff's office. A deputy with a broad frame and tired eyes listened patiently as Thomas explained. "Daniel Hayes," Thomas said, "American, mid-40s, tall beard. He was with me through the storm." Then he disappeared last night. The deputy leaned back in his chair, scratching his chin. That name sounds familiar. Might have had a record here years back. Not criminal, exactly, just troubled. Folks said he used to come around every December, staying near the lake. Always kept to himself. Thomas frowned. So, this isn't the first time he's vanished? Not the first, the deputy said. And probably not the last. Some people, they're tied to this place in ways the rest of us don't understand. The words lingered with Thomas all afternoon. He wanted to search again, to comb through the woods, to find Daniel and drag him back to warmth. But something in the deputy's tone told him it would be useless. Daniel belonged to the snow now, bound to that lake and the memories it carried. 2 days later, Thomas boarded a bus to Reno, his journal heavy in his bag. The ride wound through icy roads, the mountains looming on either side. He watched the trees blur past, each one coated in frost like glass sculptures. At the airport, as he waited for his flight back to London, he pulled out the photograph once more. He traced the edges with his thumb, as though the faded paper held some answer he had yet to uncover. When the boarding call echoed through the terminal, he hesitated. Part of him wanted to leave the photograph on the seat beside him, to let it remain in America with the story it carried. But another part knew he couldn't. The image had become his burden, too, a reminder that survival was not just about making it through the storm, but about what came after. On the plane, as the engines roared and the ground fell away, Thomas stared out at the endless stretch of clouds. For the first time in days, he felt warmth that wasn't from a fire. Yet beneath it all was a lingering weight, the kind that followed quietly, settling into the corners of memory where it would never truly fade. Back in Manchester, life resumed with its familiar rhythm. Buses hissed down wet streets. Neighbors waved. The kettle whistled in the evenings. But each night, when the world was quiet, Thomas found himself returning to that cabin by the lake, to the snow that had silenced everything, to the shadow of a man who had vanished into the forest. And always, on his bedside table, the photograph remained. It watched him like a question he could never answer. The photograph had become a silent presence between them, more powerful than the storm itself. Thomas couldn't unsee the image, though he had only caught its edges. There had been a face, yes, faintly lit, perhaps a woman's, though the details had blurred before his eyes had fully processed them. The tension in Daniel's voice made it clear that Thomas was not supposed to notice. The fire snapped loudly, a sharp crack that made both men glance at it briefly, though neither moved. Daniel finally picked up his parka and folded it tightly, sliding it onto the seat beside him as though to protect whatever was hidden inside. His jaw was clenched, his eyes a pale reflection of the flames. "You've got questions," Daniel said after a long silence. His voice was calm, but it carried something heavier beneath the surface. "But it's better if you don't ask them." Thomas swallowed, his throat dry. "I wasn't going to pry. Everyone has their private things." Daniel gave a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Private things. Yes, let's call it that." The rest of the night passed in fractured quiet. Daniel eventually lay back on the sofa, closing his eyes, though Thomas could see the muscles in his face twitch as if he were grinding through thoughts even in near sleep. Thomas sat by the window, pretending to read from his travel journal, but barely registering the words he wrote. His mind kept circling back to the photograph. Who had it shown? Why was Daniel carrying it so close? And why did he seem to guard it like a secret worth killing for? When dawn arrived, the forest looked peaceful again, though the silence felt heavier than ever. The snow still trapped him inside, but a pale light filtered through the frosted glass, giving the cabin a dreamlike quality. Daniel was already awake, sitting at the table, sharpening a small knife with slow, deliberate movements. The metallic scrape of steel on steel filled the room, setting Thomas's nerves on edge. Planning to cut with that? Thomas asked lightly, trying to diffuse his unease. Daniel glanced up, his eyes unreadable, planning to be ready. Storms have a way of bringing out the worst in people, don't you think? Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he busied himself with melting snow in a pot over fire. The ritual of daily survival, the water, the rationing of food, the tending to flames, became a thin shield against the questions pressing in on him. But the weight of Daniel's presence grew each hour, his movements too measured, his silences too loaded. On the second morning of the new year, a strange sound echoed faintly from beyond the cabin walls. Not the usual groaning of trees or the shifting of snow. It was distant, muffled, yet distinct. A low rumble, then a crack, almost like something mechanical straining against the cold. Thomas froze, spoon halfway to his mouth. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Daniel set down his knife. His gaze flicked toward the window, but his face remained guarded. "Could be the ice breaking on the lake," he said. But Thomas wasn't convinced. He had grown up in England, far from frozen lakes, yet he had traveled enough to know what nature sounded like. This had been different, more deliberate, like an engine trying to start, failing, then stopping again. All morning, Thomas kept listening. Occasionally, the sound returned, sometimes stronger, sometimes fading into silence. By afternoon, he was certain. Someone, somewhere beyond the trees, was trying to get a vehicle moving through the snow. Relief should have washed over him. It meant they weren't as isolated as he thought. Perhaps help was closer than he imagined. But when he looked at Daniel, the other man's expression unsettled him even more. Daniel seemed tense, almost alarmed by the thought of others approaching. "They shouldn't come here," Daniel muttered at one point, more to himself than to Thomas. "Why not?" Thomas asked. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Because it's safer this way. You don't understand." Thomas didn't push further. He was beginning to realize that every time Daniel revealed something, it raised more questions than it answered. The days blurred again, but the atmosphere shifted. The storm had broken, yet the sense of danger had only deepened. At night, Thomas sometimes thought he saw shadows moving outside the window, shapes that vanished when he tried to focus. Daniel never acknowledged them, though Thomas caught him checking his knife more often, his movements sharp, restless, like a man waiting for something he both feared and expected. On the fifth night, when the moon glowed faintly above the snowbound forest, Thomas finally gathered the courage to speak. "That photograph," he said quietly, breaking the uneasy silence. "You don't have to tell me everything, but I need to know if it's something I should be worried about." Daniel didn't answer immediately. He leaned back, staring at the flames as though the answer might rise from the sparks. Finally, he pulled the parka close and slipped the photograph out, holding it loosely between his fingers. Thomas saw it clearly this time. A woman with long dark hair, smiling faintly, her hand resting on the shoulder of a young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. The photo was creased, faded, yet carried a warmth that the cabin lacked. "My wife," Daniel said finally, his voice low, "and my daughter." Thomas felt a ripple of relief. The image was ordinary, even tender. "They must be worried about you, stuck here." Daniel's eyes flickered with something darker. "They're not worried, because they can't be. They're gone." The words hung in the air like frost. Thomas's stomach tightened. "Gone? You mean—" Daniel slid the photo back into his pocket before Thomas could finish. "Don't ask," he whispered. "Don't ever ask." Thomas didn't press him, but that night he barely slept. The cabin seemed smaller, the walls too close, the silence too heavy. He couldn't decide what unsettled him more, the storm that trapped him, or the storm that seemed to rage inside Daniel. By the next morning, the distant engine noise grew louder, more insistent. Someone was definitely out there. Thomas felt hope stir again, though it was quickly met by Daniel's sharp warning. "If anyone comes here," Daniel said firmly, standing by the door with his knife in hand, "let me speak first. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded slowly, though his mind screamed with questions. Who was Daniel afraid of? Why did he guard his past so fiercely? And what would happen if the people out there reached the cabin before he found the answers? The snow outside glittered like shards of glass under the pale sun, beautiful and cruel all at once. And somewhere in that endless white, footsteps were drawing closer. The footsteps came first. Faint crunches in the snow, uneven, moving closer to the frozen forest. Thomas held his breath, straining to separate the sound from the groans of settling ice and the distant echoes of the lake. But the rhythm of boots sinking into powder was undeniable. Daniel stood by the door, rigid, his hand wrapped tight around the handle of the knife. His eyes were sharp, scanning the cabin as though measuring exits, shadows, angles of cover. Thomas had never seen a man look so alert, so coiled, as if every second might turn into violence. Then came a voice. "Hello? Anyone inside?" It was muffled by the thick wooden walls, but Thomas could tell it belonged to a man, strong, clear, with an edge of authority. Not desperate, not like Daniel when he had arrived. This voice was steadier, purposeful. Thomas moved toward the door, but Daniel raised his hand, stopping him cold. "Not a word," Daniel whispered, his breath harsh. Thomas frowned. They could be search and rescue, or they could be worse. Daniel cut him off, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "Let me handle it." The knocks followed. Not frantic, not polite. Firm. 3 measured thuds that echoed through the cabin. The same rhythm Thomas had heard that first night, though then it had been Daniel himself outside. A strange chill ran down his spine at the symmetry of it. Daniel opened the door only an inch, his body blocking the gap. Cold air swept in, along with the sight of a tall man in a heavy green parka. A beanie pulled low over his brow. Snow clung to his shoulders, his breath steaming in the frosty air. "Evening," the man said, his eyes narrowing slightly as he peered inside. "Name's Officer Bradley, Placer County Sheriff's Office. We've been looking for stranded vehicles since the storm. Saw tracks leading this way." Thomas exhaled in relief, but Daniel didn't shift. "Tracks?" he repeated, his voice careful. Bradley nodded. "A car stuck half a mile back. Empty. Looked like someone abandoned it. Belongs to Daniel Hayes, registered Sacramento." Silence. The fire cracked, the only sound inside the cabin. Daniel's grip on the door tightened, his knuckles whitening. For a moment Thomas thought he might slam it shut, but then Daniel forced a small smile. "That's mine. Slid off the road. I found this cabin and waited out the storm." Bradley's gaze flicked past Daniel, settling briefly on Thomas. "You alone here?" Thomas hesitated, but Daniel spoke quickly. "Yeah, just me. The cabin was unlocked." Something about the answer felt off, and Bradley seemed to sense it too. His eyes lingered on Thomas, as though waiting for him to contradict the story. Thomas opened his mouth, but Daniel pressed harder against the door, narrowing the gap. "I appreciate you checking in, officer, but we're fine. We'll head out once the snowplows clear the road." Bradley didn't move immediately. His breath came in slow puffs, his eyes calculating. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but keep the fire going. Nights will stay rough. And if you hear engines tomorrow, follow the noise. We'll be clearing Highway 89 by noon." "Understood," Daniel said quickly, and before Thomas could say another word, he shut the door with finality. The cabin sank back into silence. The footsteps outside receded, the crunch of boots fading into the distance until there was nothing but the wind again. Thomas turned on Daniel. "What the hell was that?" Why lie? Daniel paced the room, the knife still in his hand. Because men like him don't ask questions for no reason. If he knew you were here with me, he'd drag us both out before morning. And that would be a bad thing? Thomas demanded. Daniel stopped pacing. His eyes, shadowed and hollow, locked onto Thomas. You don't understand. Once they know where I am, once they see me, everything changes. The words landed like stones in Thomas's chest. He wanted to press, to demand the truth, but Daniel's face was a wall of tension, and there was something in his expression, grief, anger, fear, that made Thomas swallow his questions. The hours stretched long after that encounter. Daniel barely slept, his eyes darting toward the window every time the forest creaked. Thomas lay awake too, trying to piece together the fragments. The hidden photograph, the lie to the officer, the fear that seemed to gnaw at Daniel's every movement. Morning came pale and bitter. The fire had died low, and Thomas rose to stack fresh wood onto the embers. Outside, the snow reflected a hard light, almost blinding. He half expected to hear the rumble of engines, to see plows cutting through the frozen drifts. But the forest remained still. Daniel emerged from the sofa, his face drawn. We need to leave, he said suddenly. Leave. Thomas looked at the snow piled against the cabin walls. On foot? That's madness. We'd freeze. It's worse if we stay, Daniel muttered. He began gathering his things quickly, his parka, the knife, the photograph tucked deep inside. His movements were jerky, rushed, like a man running out of time. Daniel stopped. Thomas's voice was firmer now. Steady. You owe me an explanation. You say we can't trust them. You say it's safer if we stay hidden. Fine. But I'm not stepping into a frozen wilderness on nothing but your paranoia. Daniel froze, shoulders rigid. Slowly he turned, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He held the photograph again, staring at it as if it were the only real thing left in the world. My wife's name was Laura, he said, his voice hoarse. My daughter was Emily. Last spring they were killed. A car accident, they said. But it wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. I knew too much about people who didn't want me alive. They silenced my family to keep me quiet. Thomas felt his chest tighten. And you think they're still after you? I don't think, Daniel whispered. I know. And if that officer brings me back, I won't live to see the week through. The air in the cabin thickened. Thomas stared at Daniel, trying to read him. Was this grief twisting a man's mind, or was it the truth, raw and terrifying? Before he could respond, another sound cut through the forest. Not footsteps this time, not the groan of ice. An engine, louder, closer. Then another. Vehicles, plural, crawling across the snow-laden path. Daniel's head snapped toward the window, his body tense. They've found me, he muttered. Thomas's pulse surged. It could be the plows, just like the officer said. But Daniel's expression told him otherwise. Fear had carved deep lines across his face, the kind of fear that only comes from certainty. The engines grew louder, echoing against the mountains, drawing nearer to the cabin. Daniel gripped his knife tighter. Whatever happens next, Thomas, you didn't see me. The firelight flickered wildly as shadows crossed the snow outside. And then came the knock. Not 3 slow thuds this time. Fast, urgent, demanding. The knocking grew louder, faster, an unrelenting rhythm that rattled the thin wooden walls of cabin. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. He had spent nights imagining storms, snow, isolation. But this was something else. This was tangible, purposeful, and dangerously near. Daniel crouched behind the table, knife gripped tight in one hand. The photograph pressed into his other palm like a shield. His breathing was shallow, rapid, almost synchronized with the knocks. His eyes flicked toward Thomas, and for the first time, Thomas noticed a gleam of raw panic, the kind that doesn't hide behind bravado. "They're not here to help," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You need to trust me." Thomas swallowed hard. His mind raced. The snow outside glittered under the dim light from the fire, and the shadows of trees danced across the walls as if alive. "Then what do we do?" he asked. Daniel's hand moved to the window. He peered through a narrow crack, eyes scanning the forest. "We wait until we see who steps through the trees," he said. "If it's them, we move fast. If it's not, we improvise." The engine noises outside had grown distinct. Several vehicles approaching in careful formation, their headlights slicing through the falling snow. Thomas's stomach churned as he realized they were trapped, pinned between the forest, the frozen lake behind them, and whatever or whoever was heading their way. The cabin door shook with another series of heavy knocks. Daniel pressed his body against it, knife ready, jaw set. "Get down," he ordered. Thomas lowered himself behind the sofa. The firelight flickered across his face, revealing sweat and pale fear. He could hear his own heartbeat, irregular, frantic, echoing too loudly in the enclosed space. And then, through the cracks of the cabin walls, he saw them. Shadows moving across the snow, figures tall, silhouettes of men or perhaps more. They carried something, boxes or maybe equipment, but their intent felt unmistakably hostile. "They know I'm here," Daniel muttered, almost to himself. His hands trembled slightly as he set the photograph down on the floor where Thomas could see it. The image of Laura and Emily caught the firelight, their frozen smiles a cruel contrast to the chaos outside. Thomas wanted to reach for it, to grab it and reassure himself it was real, that life still existed somewhere, but Daniel's gaze stopped him. "They won't hesitate," Daniel whispered. "If they find me, it'll be over in seconds." The first figure reached the tree lean, stepping lightly over the drifted snow. Thomas felt the tension compress his chest, like the room itself had shrunk. The shadow moved closer, stopping near the cabin. The man raised an arm, gesturing toward the cabin. Others followed, their movement methodical, trained. Daniel slid his knife along the table edge, listening to the faint, crunching steps outside. "On my mark," he said quietly. "You follow exactly. Do not hesitate. Do not argue." Thomas nodded, though his hands shook. Every instinct screamed to bolt, to escape, to run into the snow, but the icy fingers of fear held him in place. The knocking stopped suddenly. The figures outside paused, as if sensing the stillness inside. Then came a faint voice, low, authoritative, male. "Daniel Hayes, we know you're in there. Step out with your hands up. Nobody has to get hurt." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Thomas, now." Thomas followed without question. They moved toward the back door, the one facing the frozen lake, hoping the figures at the front wouldn't notice. Every step sank into powder, each movement loud in the otherwise silent forest. They reached the door, and Daniel threw it open. The cold hit like a wall, stinging Thomas's face. The lake lay behind them, a frozen expanse of white, its surface shimmering under the dim, overcast sky. The forest stretched endlessly on either side, skeletal trees cracking occasionally as the wind passed through. Daniel gestured for Thomas to follow him onto the ice. Thomas hesitated, looking back at the cabin. The firelight glowed faintly behind him, a small beacon of warmth and safety. But the men outside were advancing, boots crunching rhythmically in the snow. He had no choice. They moved across the frozen lake cautiously. Every step was a test. The ice groaned, shifting under their weight. Daniel's movements were deliberate, careful, trained. Thomas tried to match his pace, each footstep threatening to crack the fragile sheet beneath. Halfway across, Thomas glimpsed movement from the cabin. Figures were at the door now, shining flashlights, voices raised in command. One yelled, and Thomas realized they were trying to split attention, to force them into the open. Daniel pulled him toward a narrow ridge along the lake's edge, where a cluster of pine trees provided cover. "We wait here," Daniel whispered. "Let them search the cabin first. They'll be distracted." Thomas crouched low, shivering, the photograph still clutched tightly in Daniel's parka pocket. He couldn't see the faces of the figures clearly, but he could hear the murmur of commands, the clanging of metal against the cabin walls. Minutes stretched. Hours, it seemed, though Thomas knew it could only be moments. The wind carried scents of pine, frozen earth, and faint smoke from the cabin chimney. Every sound was amplified. The snap of a twig, the distant groan of ice, the faint whistle of snow moving against itself. Daniel's voice cut through his panic. "We move now. Quietly. Follow me." They slipped through the pine cluster, moving toward a denser patch of forest where the undergrowth would mask their presence. Thomas's lungs burned, his boots filling with snow with every step. Behind them, the cabin burned brightly, now visible as a beacon to any eyes watching from the tree lean. Thomas dared to glance back. The figures were still at the cabin, some attempting to peer inside, others gesturing, speaking urgently. Daniel was focused, eyes forward, knife at the ready. Thomas realized the depth of his skill, survival, evasion, and patience honed over years of isolation and grief. The forest thickened, each tree a pillar of shadow, each branch brushing against their faces. Daniel led them in silence, every movement calculated. Thomas could barely keep up, muscles trembling, adrenaline coursing through him like fire in his veins. Suddenly, a low growl, unmistakably human, broke the quiet. A figure appeared ahead on the path, partially hidden by trees. Thomas froze. Daniel did not. "They've split," Daniel whispered. "We can't let them surround us." The man stepped forward into a faint patch of moonlight, revealing a face partially covered with frost, eyes hard, determined. He carried a small handheld device, perhaps a tracker or camera, but Thomas couldn't tell. Daniel's hand tightened on his knife. "Move," he hissed. They slid silently past the figure, pressing against tree trunks, shadows merging with shadows. Hours seemed to pass as they navigated through the forest. Thomas's mind raced with questions. Who were these men truly? Were they officers, bounty hunters, or something darker? And why was Daniel so certain that capture meant death? Finally, Daniel paused near a frozen creek, thin ice shimmering under the night sky. "We hide here until dawn," he said. His voice was calm but carried the tension of a man who had been running far too long. "Then we go south, far enough they won't follow." Thomas sank to his knees, shivering. The wind tore at his clothes, his hair, his exposed skin. But he couldn't stop looking at Daniel. Every feature was carved from intensity and despair. He realized in that moment that the man beside him had been living in a world of constant danger, one Thomas could never have imagined. The creek lay quiet, snow drifting softly onto the ice. Thomas sat with his back to a tree, the photograph now safe in Daniel's parka. For the first time, he allowed himself to breathe, to imagine, however briefly, that survival was still possible. But somewhere deep in the forest, hidden behind the endless expanse of snow, he could feel it. Eyes watching, waiting, never blinking, never resting. Daniel knelt beside him, whispering, "This is far from over, and it will get worse before it gets better." Thomas swallowed hard, understanding that the storm outside had been only the beginning. The forest seemed endless, a frozen labyrinth of pine and ice, shadows stretching like long fingers across the snow. Thomas's lungs burned with each breath, his boots sinking deep into drifts that left his legs heavy and exhausted. Behind him, Daniel moved like a predator, swift and silent, navigating the uneven terrain with unnerving precision. Thomas followed, unable to take his eyes off him, simultaneously terrified and awed. They had not spoken since the night of the chase. Words seemed unnecessary. Survival was all that mattered now. Thomas's fingers were numb, but his grip on the photograph inside Daniel's parka was tighter than ever. He glanced down at it, Laura's face smiling, Emily's small hand resting on her mother's shoulder, and felt a pang of sorrow he couldn't name. That photograph was a tether to a past Thomas couldn't begin to understand, yet it grounded him somehow in the chaos around him. A sudden sound, a snapping branch, too close, made Thomas jerk sideways. He nearly stumbled, but Daniel's hand shot out, steadying him with surprising strength. "Quiet," Daniel whispered, eyes scanning the darkness. "They're near." Thomas's stomach sank. The voices from the cabin had faded, replaced by the subtle, deliberate noises of men moving through the forest. Boots crunching, voices hushed but commanding. The men were organized professionals. Thomas felt the weight of his own inadequacy. He had no training, no knowledge of survival like Daniel, yet he trusted him blindly. Hours passed. The moon moved across the sky, faint and pale, offering little light through the thick canopy. Every step they took seemed to echo unnaturally in the silent forest. Daniel paused at intervals, crouching to listen, adjusting their path to avoid unseen traps or patrols. Thomas's body ached, his mind teetering between exhaustion and adrenaline-fueled alertness. Finally, they reached a small hollow beside a cliff overlooking the frozen lake. The ice stretched for miles, reflecting the dim glow of moonlight and scattered starlight. Daniel pressed Thomas to the ground behind a cluster of snow-laden bushes. "Stay low," he whispered. "Do not move until I say." Through the trees, Thomas glimpsed movement. A cluster of figures, shadowed and deliberate, cutting across the snow toward the cabin. They were searching systematically, spreading out, their flashlights cutting arcs through the night. Thomas's heart raced. They were close, too close. Daniel's voice was almost a growl. "They'll check the cabin, then the perimeter. We need to be gone before that happens." Thomas tried to focus, but his mind kept returning to the photograph. "Daniel," he whispered, "what exactly do they want with you? Why are they like this?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He shifted, lowering his hood to wipe frost from his eyes. "I told you, Thomas. It's not safe to know. Some things are better left buried, and I've buried enough already." Thomas wanted to argue, to demand more, but he sensed the danger. The men outside could close in at any second. He swallowed his frustration and obeyed. Daniel led them along the cliffside, careful not to disturb loose rocks or branches. They moved slowly, deliberately, the frozen lake stretching beneath them like a mirror of the night sky. Each step was a gamble. A crack in the ice, a snap of wood, or a misplaced foot could expose them to the hunters below. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a narrow inlet, partially obscured by boulders and trees. Daniel crouched low, motioning Thomas to follow. "Here, we wait." Thomas sank to the snow, shivering violently, not only from cold but from fear. He could see Daniel's face now, etched with lines of grief, exhaustion, and relentless determination. There was a story in those eyes, a story of lost survival, and a man hunted by ghosts, both living and dead. Minutes dragged. Then came the first sound, a voice low and urgent, echoing faintly over the ice. "He's out there." Spread out, search the perimeter. Daniel's hand tightened around his knife. "They've split," he whispered. "We can't let them surround us." They waited, silent, the tension stretching until it was almost unbearable. Then Daniel made his move. He rose slowly, scanning the forest ahead, before taking a decisive step onto the ice. Thomas followed, heart hammering in his chest. The surface creaked under their weight, but it held for now. The frozen lake became a narrow corridor of escape. Daniel led, Thomas trailing, the darkness swallowing their figures. Their footprints marked the pristine snow, a trail they could only hope would not be followed. Suddenly, a shout rang out. "Over there!" "Stop them!" Thomas's heart leaped. Figures emerged from the forest, weapons in hand, their silhouettes stark against the snowy landscape. Daniel pivoted, grabbing Thomas's arm. "Run! Don't look back!" They sprinted across the ice, limbs burning, lungs screaming. Behind them, the snow erupted as men pursued, boots cutting arcs through the frozen surface. Thomas stumbled once, falling hard, but Daniel grabbed him, pulling him to his feet without slowing. Branches whipped against their faces, cutting skin and stealing breaths. The forest closed around them, narrowing paths, hiding traps of ice and stone. Thomas could barely think, only move, only survive. Finally, they reached a dense thicket. Daniel shoved them both into the undergrowth, pressing Thomas down against the frozen ground. "Quiet," he hissed. "Hold your breath if you have to." The hunters passed by, unaware of their presence. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs, each beat threatening to betray them. The wind whipped through the trees, carrying the sound pursuit further down the lake. Daniel leaned close, his breath cold against Thomas's ear. "We're not safe yet," he whispered. "We need to make it to the ridge. From there, we can find a route south, into the valley. They won't follow us there, not easily." Thomas nodded weakly, trembling from cold, exhaustion, and fear. He knew Daniel was right, though his mind struggled to process how they could survive the next hours. Hours passed like this, moving from cover to cover, silent and cautious, every step calculated. Thomas's feet were numb, his fingers useless. He leaned on Daniel's shoulder, trusting him completely. Finally, as the first hints of dawn streaked the sky with pale light, they reached the ridge. Below them, the valley stretched out, a landscape of snow-draped trees and frozen streams. The hunters were nowhere in sight. Daniel dropped to the ground, gasping for air, knife still at his side. "We're not out yet," he said, "but this is our first real chance to get away." Thomas looked out over the valley. For the first time in days, he saw hope, not warmth, not safety, but the possibility of escape. He dared to think that perhaps, against all odds, they could survive the storm outside and the storm that haunted Daniel inside. Daniel handed him the photograph. "Keep it close," he said. "It's the only thing that reminds me why I have to keep moving, why I can't let them find me." Thomas held it tightly, feeling the paper's fragile edges against his frozen fingers. He looked at Daniel, at the man beside him who had faced grief, danger, and ghosts most could never imagine. And for the first time, he understood survival was not just about escaping the forest, the storm, or the hunters. It was about carrying the past and the memory of what was lost with you, even when the world seemed determined to crush it. The sun rose fully, casting the valley in pale gold. Thomas and Daniel began their slow, careful descent, eyes scanning the terrain, senses sharpened by fear and necessity. Each step was heavy, deliberate, and filled with unspoken understanding. The journey was far from over, and whatever awaited in the valley could be worse than the storm, the hunters, or the frozen lake. The forest behind them was silent once more, but the memory of the chase, the sound of boots in the snow, and the shadow of the men hunting Daniel would linger in Thomas's mind forever. And as they disappeared into the valley, the snow drifted softly over their footprints, erasing the evidence of their passage, hiding them from the world, and leaving only the lingering tension of a story not yet finished. The valley stretched out before them, a frozen expanse of white broken only by jagged pines and scattered rocks. Thomas followed Daniel carefully, each step slow, deliberate, avoiding ice-covered streams and hidden pitfalls. The air was biting, cutting through layers of clothing, and each breath left a small cloud of frost. The world felt suspended in a fragile moment between night and day, between life and the unknown. Daniel moved with practiced caution, scanning every ridge and dip in terrain, every shadow that might conceal danger. Thomas's heart raced with each step, not from exertion alone, but from a knowledge that danger had not yet passed. The hunters who pursued them were still out there, their intent lethal, their presence unseen but deeply felt. "Thomas," Daniel said quietly, stopping beside a large boulder and gesturing for him to crouch. "We can rest for a moment here, but only for a moment. We can't risk being seen from a ridge." Thomas sank to the snow, his legs trembling. His body ached in every joint, and his fingers were numb despite gloves and multiple layers. He pressed the photograph against his chest, Laura and Emily's faces seeming to smile at him through the bitter cold. He drew strength from it, a small spark of warmth in a landscape otherwise unforgiving. They stayed there in near silence, broken only by the distant howl of wind through the valley and the faint crackle of ice under the weight of hidden snowdrifts. Time stretched in this frozen world, each second measured, deliberate, as if the valley itself were holding its breath. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice low, almost reverent. This valley is the only way south without being spotted. If we make it to the other side, the terrain opens up and the hunters won't follow. Not easily, but we have to move before they adjust. Thomas nodded. He trusted Daniel implicitly now, despite the fear gnawing at his chest. He had seen the man navigate storms, snow, and shadows with uncanny precision. He had witnessed grief, rage, and loss carved into Daniel's features. Yet also a determination so raw and unyielding that Thomas could not help but believe survival was possible. They moved again, each step slow and careful. The snow drifted around them like fine sand in a desert, muffling sounds, erasing footprints from the hunter's view. Still, Thomas could not shake the feeling of being watched. Every gust of wind, every snapping branch, every distant echo made his pulse spike. Hours passed. The sun rose fully, pale and distant behind low clouds, casting a soft gray light across the valley. Shadows of the trees stretched long across the snow, creating the illusion of figures that moved at the edge of perception. Thomas felt his muscles tighten with every imagined threat. As they crested a ridge, Daniel paused and looked back toward the forest they had escaped. The cabin, the frozen lake, and the hunters were far behind, hidden now by distance and terrain. But the memory of the chase, the fear, and the relentless pursuit clung to him as a part of his shadow. "We're almost there," Daniel whispered. "A few more miles and the terrain opens. After that, we can find roads, towns, maybe even someone who will believe our story." Thomas exhaled, though the cold made it sting. "Do you really think we'll be safe?" he asked. Daniel's gaze hardened, eyes scanning the distant ridges. "Safe is a relative term, but we'll survive, and that's enough." They descended into a narrow gorge, where the snow was deeper, and the trees formed a natural corridor. The wind was muffled here, the valley's walls blocking sound and sight. It was a precarious sanctuary, offering both cover and risk. Each step had to be measured. A single misstep could send one of them plunging into hidden crevices or icy streams below. As they pressed on, Thomas noticed signs of the forest coming back to life despite the harsh winter. The tracks of small animals, the occasional twig bent under weight, the faint sounds of water running beneath ice. These small indicators of life reminded him that the world continued beyond their immediate fear, beyond the chase, beyond the ice and snow that threatened to consume them. Daniel moved with a sense of urgency tempered by caution. Every gesture, every glance, carried the weight of experience and trauma. Thomas followed closely, realizing that the man's every instinct had been sharpened by loss and survival. Daniel had lived in a world where the line between hunter and hunted was thin, where each choice carried immediate and lethal consequences. By mid-afternoon, the valley opened slightly. The trees thinned, revealing patches of frozen streams that glimmered like silver beneath the weak winter sun. Daniel led Thomas toward one of these natural pathways, moving swiftly but carefully. Their pace increased, fueled by adrenaline and the desperate hope of reaching a safe area before nightfall. Suddenly, a faint sound carried over the valley, a distant engine, low and hesitant, echoing against the cliffs. Thomas froze. "Daniel, they're still following us." Daniel's expression tightened. "Not this time. They've lost the trail. The valley shifts too much, the ice too unstable. We bought ourselves some time." Thomas exhaled, relief mingling with lingering fear. The valley seemed to breathe around them, expansive, dangerous, and beautiful all at once. They moved in cautious silence, each aware of the other's presence, each step a testament to survival and trust forged in the crucible of fear. As evening approached, they found a sheltered alcove beneath a large rock formation. The overhang provided protection from the wind, and they sank into the snow, exhausted but alive. Daniel pulled Thomas close, his hands wrapped around the younger man's shoulders. "Rest," he said softly. "We need our strength. The night comes quickly, and it is unforgiving." Thomas rested his head against Daniel's shoulder, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He thought of Laura and Emily again, the photograph clutched against his chest, and the sense of purpose that Daniel carried with him. They were shadows in a frozen world, But they were not defeated. Night fell fully. The valley plunged into darkness, pierced only by the faint glimmer of starlight. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it both threat and promise. Thomas closed his eyes, trusting that the valley had given him a reprieve, however temporary. They would move again at dawn, navigating the frozen terrain with the same careful strategy that had carried them this far. They would survive, because survival was all Daniel had ever known, and now Thomas shared that understanding. In the quiet of the night, Thomas realized that the story of their escape of the hunt and of loss would stay with him forever. But survival had given them something precious. The chance to continue, to face another day, to step into a world beyond fear, if only carefully, cautiously, and together. And as the wind swept across the valley, Thomas felt the faintest trace of hope. The snow would erase their tracks. The hunters would lose their trail. And for now, they were alive, shadows moving through the winter, survivors against all odds, carrying with them the echoes of the past and the promise of an uncertain future. The valley was silent, save for the distant whisper of the wind. Daniel and Thomas huddled beneath the overhang, sharing warmth and vigilance, ready to face whatever came next, for they had endured the storm, outwitted the hunters, and survived the frozen expanse. And while the story was far from over, they had found a fragile peace, a temporary sanctuary in a world that had demanded everything of them. The night deepened. The stars glimmered coldly, and the snow drifted gently over the valley floor. Somewhere far below, the ice of the lake reflected the faint moonlight, hiding secrets and shadows. But for Thomas and Daniel, the valley had given them a moment of clarity, of survival, of fragile hope. And in that frozen, endless expanse, they had discovered that even in the harshest winters, the human spirit could endure, could fight, and could persist no matter the cost. The wind whispered again, as if carrying a message through the trees. Survival was not the end, but the beginning of something else. An uncertain, dangerous, and yet remarkable journey through the wintered world of Lake Tahoe. And in the quiet, Thomas realized that whatever waited for them beyond the valley, they would face it together, with the memory of what had been lost, the urgency of what must be protected, and the determination to survive at all costs.